Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jason Ryan here with my co-chair Joel Yu from Enchanted Rock. Thanks for joining us today for our October workshop of the ADER task force. Just a reminder that we are recording the session, and that recording will be made available to everyone on our YouTube channel in case you want to go back and review parts of it, or if those folks on your team were unable to make it today, they can go back and take a look at this workshop. The most of the folks on here are tried and true already on our process, but for those of you that might be new, the raise hand feature is the best way to ask a question, and then we'll just go in the order of the raised hands, right? So that's a great way to make sure that the speaker during the workshop today can see that you have a question. And if multiple people have questions, it's easy. We'll just go in the order of the raised hands. We also have the chat function. If there's information that you want to put in the chat, ask questions in the chat, post resources in the chat. That's another good way to interact during this session. We will have slides that we'll post in the project after today, so you don't have to worry about taking pictures of them or taking lots of notes. We'll make the slides available in Project 53911, along with the link to the YouTube recording of today's session. And finally, I do want to thank everybody that got together and did some work, exchanged some thoughts since our last workshop in September. I know that all of us have full-time day jobs, and so I appreciate everybody that spent some time gathering people's thoughts, getting consensus on ideas since the last session. I appreciate all that you do and all the time that you give to the task force, and appreciate our partners at the PUC, OPUC, and ERCOT for their time on this topic as well. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to you, Joel, and walk us through the agenda for today.
All right. Thanks, Jason. Sharing the agenda here, we've got a brief discussion item, a presentation from Scott Hinson on Commissioner Glotfelty memo item number 1, a broad question around interoperability. ERCOT is available on our call today and wants to provide a quick recap of the slides presented last meeting and to gather any feedback or thoughts on the proposal as was presented. And then we'll have a brief discussion from the technical expertise and institutions segment of the task force on a follow-up to one of the action items from a last call in our roadmap to 80 megawatts discussion. There was a question of whether or what data we need to pull together around the potential megawatts available if we are to keep opening up the ADER program and expanding participation. And then we'll take some time at the end, I thought, to just recap the open action items that we started listing out last meeting and discuss what's next. So with that, I guess if there are no questions on the agenda or suggestions on the agenda, we'll turn it over to Scott.
Hi, everybody. Sorry I'm not on camera. For those that were here a little bit early, I'm in the San Francisco airport at the moment and Wi-Fi is a bit spotty. So please don't hesitate to stop me and tell me to repeat something if it drops out or anything like that. My name is Scott Henson. I'm the CTO of Pecan Street Inc. We are a nonprofit based in Austin, Texas, and have been around for about 14 years. We're best known for our work collecting energy data sets behind the meter. We get about 22 billion data points on how people are using and producing energy daily. But today I'm talking about interoperability and accessibility. I come at this from a long background of working through standards. In previous iterations, in previous careers, I have helped design cable modems to the DOCSIS standard and some industrial test equipment to the relevant IEC and IEEE and UL safety standards, as well as CISPR and FCC compliance for radiated and conducted emissions. Let's go to the next slide. One of the critical functions that standards provide is interoperability. I'm dating myself by saying that I have had computers with every single one of these connectors on them. This is an example, a sort of silly example I pulled. This, was sort of the story for many years. And the functionality for all of these devices and connections, internal and external to the computer that you see on the left, has largely been replaced by an industry standard on the right. And one of the things that where this particular example sort of falls apart is the lack of critical nature for the USB standard, right? You're not going to make a life safety piece of equipment depend on a USB 3 connector. You're just, that's not going to work. Somebody has, as I said, I've gotten medical devices designed through these standards, but the interoperability portion is applicable here, right? And so we as consumers, we as users of these technologies have benefited greatly from this industrial standard that has taken place. Next slide. For renewable energy devices and distributed generation, the standards landscape can be a bit confusing. I will freely admit it. When I started working for the thin film solar panel manufacturer, and it was the job of getting those panels through the UL IEC testing process was dropped on my desk. It was sort of a, oh boy, here we go, because it was multiple standards. Some of them were in conflict with each other, since some of them were US based, some of them were international based. But in large part, once you really understood them, it got to the point where it was like, okay, I understand why we need all of these standards and why we need to apply and adopt these standards in whole. So they tend to be grouped, and people tend to think of them as safety standards or performance and functionality standards. But in reality, these standards have aspects of both. So IEEE 1547, for instance, I would start to argue that some of this functionality that we were talking about, since we are using these systems to provide ancillary services, since we are using these systems to provide transmission and distribution services, that they become safety, because if they don't do their job right, it could become an outage issue or worse, right? And so I highly recommend adopting the standards as a whole. There are many regulatory bodies looking at adopting these standards as a whole once you decide exactly which ones you want to adopt, and not trying to pick and choose, because there are very bad unintended consequences if we pick and choose safety over functionality, because we are working in an industry and we are providing a service that has critical nature to it. So it really needs to be adopted as a whole. Next slide. There are winners in terms of, especially inverters for solar or battery energy storage systems, easy for me to say, that are already emerging or have emerged. There are a number of ways, for instance, for communication to be satisfied for IEEE 1547. And as I said here in the previous slide, it is important to keep relevant and adopt the whole standard. By keeping relevant, that means that as the standard changes and revisions are adopted by the standards organization that, given some grace period in order for the manufacturers to get equipment in line, the new standards are adopted in relatively short order. One of the things that I will say is I have heard some folks in the past, and not this group, but some folks in the past talk about, well, it takes time for the manufacturers to understand these new standards. That's true and not true at the same time. There is a learning period in terms of test adoption and things like that. But in large part, the major manufacturers, all the major manufacturers, have individuals that are on these standards bodies and understand what the standard is going to be before it comes out. I know this because I was on the standard bodies for solar modules, and I knew what the standard was going to be before it changed. And so you already start working to keep your products compliant. Not requiring the most current standards or the whole standard basically leads to older and less capable equipment being deployed on the grid. Basically, manufacturers will find areas where they can sell equipment that they can't seem to upgrade themselves. They can't bring in line, and they'll find areas to sell it so that they don't have to just toss it, right? And so that if you don't adopt these standards and you don't adopt them properly, you end up with a bunch of older non-standard equipment on your grid, which is not what I think any of us want. Next slide. Okay. One thing that I would caution against is that interoperability doesn't guarantee accessibility. Okay. What do I mean by that? So for instance, the SunSpec 2030 point, or IEEE 2030.5 standard, there is a security handshake, and the security handshake requires a key pair, and the manufacturer of the device has to work with the aggregator in order to allow access to that device. And so we need to have the proper language in place. And as an engineer, I am glad I don't necessarily have to develop that legal language. That is not necessarily my specialty, but there is a need to enforce that accessibility is in place. So we've had instances at Pecan Street where we were doing DOE programs. We had a small number of devices, and the manufacturer wouldn't give us access to the devices. And in that case, it was relatively easy for us to switch out 6 inverters and put 6 different inverters in that we could have access to. But that's not going to work in the state of Texas if we have a very large aggregation of components and we don't have that accessibility guaranteed. The analogy that I would make here is that, this is a car somebody has purchased, and then the car manufacturer says, yeah, but you can't drive it there. Well, that's not that's not a good place to be for those consumers, and those consumers deserve better for that. The last point that I would make is that accessibility is not necessarily a cybersecurity risk. There are ways to do this with very strong cybersecurity, very strong. There is ways to do this very safely, and we do not have to use. I don't want anybody to use cybersecurity concerns as limitation for accessibility. Next slide. That might be it. Yes, recommendations. Adopt the standards as a whole. Write a rule that automatically adopt revised standards as they come out with a grace period. And then the rule must also require accessibility. And what that looks like, that is going to be the challenge. That is going to be the difficult part. That is going to be the part that we probably have vigorous discussions around. Next slide.
I think that's the last slide, Scott.
Okay, that is my last slide. So I will take any questions, answer them as best I can, and if I can't, get back to you if there are.
So there is a question in the chat on cybersecurity.
Let's see. I'm trying to get to the chat. I'm on a very tiny laptop monitor. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
There it is. I found it. Right, cybersecurity, interested in those. Well, I mean, there's So the 2030.5 standard um, has that public-private key pair, and then it is up to the individual organizations on how to agree to share those keys appropriately. In other cases, like for instance, oh gosh, this was pre-2030.5, so this would have been 5 years ago with SMA. Pecan Street had to undergo to work with some SMA inverters. We had to get qualified with SMA, and it was a very simple qualification before they would give us the full access to the API that they used. And then the API key was a pretty strong SSH type handshake for getting access to their API. So it will vary, and in some cases, you know, one of the things that I don't like about some of the older equipment is that there is an unencrypted 2-wire Modbus interface, and that Modbus is not encrypted. That Modbus standard is not encrypted, and so for larger power plants, that does indicate some amount of risk, but a lot of times the physical access can be enough. Security can be enough there. But anybody that's using large swaths of equipment of unencrypted Modbus is asking for trouble.
Hey, this is Chase Dowling. Thanks for the color on the cybersecurity concern. The encryption protocols and connection methods make sense. I think generally, though, like any kind of cybersecurity practitioner will suggest that anything exposed to the web is a risk and at risk. And like, because this is our infrastructure, like it's not, I don't know, just saying that tokens have been exchanged is a little bit soft, and would like, you know, the task force to pay attention. Not to say that it's like an impossible barrier to overcome, but I think it's a legitimate concern, not one that like anyone's trying to hide behind.
Just to go off of that thought, Scott, I guess in prior interoperability discussions and cybersecurity discussions, I guess, you know, the question I had asked previously was around whether the interoperability standards are compatible with NERC SIP requirements in the case that an operator might potentially be operating an ADER in the market alongside a NERC jurisdictional asset from the same control room. I guess, you know, I think from a high level perspective, interoperability and accessibility makes a lot of sense. But we just don't want to, as Enchanted Rock at least, don't want to get stuck potentially having to build, you know, 2 separate control centers possibly to do DERs under one standard and large scale NERC jurisdictional assets under another standard. I'm wondering if that's something that your organization has looked at all or have thoughts on.
So we have not. We are getting more familiar with that by the second. We have been awarded a GRIP, first round GRIP grant for the state of Delaware. And all GRIP projects have been deemed a high security risk, whether or not the project actually qualifies for that. So we are an aggregation of going to end up being an aggregation of about 1,500 residential solar systems in the state of Delaware, and we're going to operate it for under the program period for the Delaware Electric Co-op, the local electric co-op, and then turn it over to them. In general, you know, the argument that I made to the DOE was we were at best a medium risk program and probably a low risk program, since our aggregation operated at 240 volts and not 100 kilovolts and up. And our aggregation was less than the single unit power level deemed to be deemed that would be a high security risk for any individual generator. It was way less than the limits in general are 20 megawatts, 75 megawatts on those templates that the DOE provided. And so for a corporate, for like your organization where you have individual assets or aggregations that could get into those territories, that is more of a concern. And the answer may end up being that there is a two control system situation, unfortunately. But that is not, we're still in the thick of it, you know, and I don't know what the final answer will be for us. So I'm still learning myself on that regard.
Well, appreciate that insight, Scott.
Yeah,
definitely interested in
so
keeping in
much
touch around that.
Yeah, having compared the low risk template to the high risk template, I would really like to do the low risk template. But that's not where I am.
Understood. Yeah.
Get a commemorative tattoo of that thing.
Well, thanks. That's all I had. It looks like we've got another comment in the chat for you.
Yes, I should have mentioned that. But yeah, this is sort of where the 1540 standard, 1547 standard as a whole, you know, and all of its dot whatevers needs to be to a bunch of detail, and it needs to be looked at for adoption. That gateway issue, you know, it still doesn't solve the issue for, say, the communication of, you know, if it was unencrypted Modbus between the gateway and the inverter. But, you know, we've actually done this at the concert. We have had many unencrypted Modbus devices that we have aggregated. And what we'll do is we will put a gateway on there. It would not have qualified at the time for 154710. We did this a few years ago. I don't even think it was out. And we did a gateway ourselves because we recognized the risk. And so the unencrypted portion of the communication between the device and our gateway was basically a, you know, because it was Modbus over TCP/IP, was a 6-foot Ethernet cable coiled up next to the device. And the device was, you know, in somebody's yard or in somebody's garage or something like that. And so our risk at that point was quite low, and everything was SSH to those gateways, so that we kept everything secure and nobody could spy on us.
Manny, go ahead.
Hey, Scott, this is Manny from I had one question about some of your conversations about interoperability. We've got about 200 plus megawatts, almost 300 megawatts of larger scale DERs. In your conversations, have there been any discussions about some of these larger DERs connected at the distribution level?
Yeah, so all of our discussions, you know, as I said, my pushback to the DOE on those power levels that I mentioned was using their DOE's own cybersecurity risk framework against them. It did not work. I was told I still had to do the high risk. So I mean, I wish I could tell you more, but that'll have to be a continuing conversation as I learn more. I literally just said, well, in this other document, you said this. I did it, you know, more professionally than that, but
All right. So for those of you that may be wondering why we're talking about this, that came in after we got started. So we do have one of the items in Commissioner Gotfelty's memo from August 14th was that we talk about how every consumer can be able to select their VPP provider regardless of the equipment that they have. And we were tasked with coming up with recommendations to make that so. Um, kind of what we're doing today, where we talk about a new topic first and then revisit the topic we had a discussion about at the last workshop. We'll talk about this item again at our next meeting and try to come up with some recommendations. But with that, are there any final questions? I see Catherine, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I had a quick question. So this last slide says that the rule must require accessibility. In addition, I assume you're talking about like a PUC rulemaking, and if so, are there other I guess state commissions that have those kinds of rules?
So it is other, I know most about Texas and New York. That is where we do most of, where we do work at the state PUC level. That is where that's where we do it. I believe there has been some attempt to address this at in California. I don't remember what that was. I will have to go back and look that up. I know that New York is grappling with this as well. And I don't know what the outcome of that will be there. They have 2 working groups on interoperability and interconnection. And my work there is adjacent to those groups. I keep being told that those groups need to be responsible for some of the stuff that they should not be responsible for, but I can see if I can go find out where they stand and how they're addressing it as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's just to that question, I believe Massachusetts, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, New Mexico, California, and Oregon have adopted 1547-2018. And there's a number of other states that are considering adopting it. And the only point I wanted to raise was the fact that I think when we were talking about interoperability in the lead up into sort of phase 2 of the pilot, Jaden Crawford had raised a point that we at Octopus, while we're supportive of interoperability, did think was a good one, which is that it probably is inappropriate to have as sort of a gating standard for participation in ADER, but is perhaps most appropriately dealt with in a rulemaking context at the PUC, and that I believe it's project 52133 could be an avenue. So just Jason, Joel, something to keep in mind as we continue to talk about this. It might make sense to talk about it in the context of, does this task force want to weigh in some way, shape, or form on the interoperability question in the context of that rulemaking, and whether that would be responsive to sort of the commissioner's request in the memo.
Got it. Thank you, Raji. Arushi, you're up next.
So Jason, could we see the memo for a second? There's a recommendation. Oh, first of all, is that a big concert recommendation, the slide we're looking at the moment?
Yes, that's Scott's slides.
Yes.
Okay, got it. All right, thanks, Scott. All right, can we see the memo for a second? Because I heard we need to make a recommendation to make that so, and I'm not sure I agree with that, but I want to read what the memo said. I thought that the language said that we need to evaluate it, and if we can all just look at it as a group, I want a sense of what we're like a better understanding, even a collective one, of what we're being asked to do. Obviously, this is a topic I filed very extensive comments on as an industry expert. I mentioned things like major litigation against PPL. That all of this is in the document recent comments. And if you're on this call and you're a retail electric provider or a co-op or a muni looking to do this, I really urge you to read some of the context from other markets that I put in my comments. But okay. The mandate there says 3 changes for the task force to consider are below. And the task force should look at if it is possible for a consumer to select a VPP provider that is not their rep. Is today's conversation primarily for this item 2? Is Jason that generally right?
This is item 1. It's every consumer should be able to select their VPP provider regardless of their equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last
Okay.
sentence that he wants the task force to make recommendations to ensure that that goal is met.
So the reason I ask is like when I heard this conversation, I'm like, all right, what will we need to do in a role anywhere? What do we recommend? I find it very hard to read 1 in isolation of 2. Only because you could select a provider of a demand side management program, which is a VPP program today. And you could have a retail electric provider today that partners with such DSM services provider. And ideally, if they're working together, then they're delivering the consumer ostensibly more or value stacks with each other. And I think, I'm not sure, but doing so would require some idea of accessibility or keys between the equipment and the rep, or between the equipment provider and the third-party VP provider, and then between that party and the rep. It just feels like 1 isn't a question we answer as just 1. And that's my comment for now, because I really want us to learn the intricacies of this from the folks who are in the business before we say that we know that answering these questions in the affirmative is the correct way to actually meet the goal that is the intent of answering the question. Super short way of saying that is I think it's problematic to do 1 without 2, because I don't understand that we are talking today, maybe we are, about the existing ways that 1 and 2 are already true today in Texas.
Any other comment or questions for Scott? All right, Scott, thank you for presenting today. And as I mentioned, we not to cut off discussion on this topic, but if people want to continue to talk about it, but we will bring it back. This is just teeing the issue up. We'll bring it back for a recap and discussion at our next meeting. So give people some time to think about it, and how we can be responsive to the request for recommendations on this topic from the task force. So with that, Joel, do you want to bring up or we don't have an ERCOT presentation, I guess, today. That was the slides that you have are the slides from the last time, but.
That's right. That's right. So I guess we could turn it over to Dave. I see he's on the call. I've got the deck from last meeting if we need to reference back. I know you wanted to recap some of what you covered last meeting before taking questions and comments.
Hey, Joel, yes. In fact, actually, Ryan has offered to do the recap. I know he was the one who presented to you all last month along with Mark. Really, the thought today was now that you all have had a month or so, or at least a few weeks here to absorb what we presented, just to make sure everyone understood it, to see if there's any remaining questions and things like that. I guess our thought is, starting to think about what a governing document would look like, trying to encapsulate what we had here listed up for phase 3 and thinking about what we think makes sense to bring some more megawatts to the overall pilot. But with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan and see what questions you'll have for us today.
Thanks, Dave. So I didn't really have much more to add to what Dave noted. Last month, Mark and I went through our thinking of what makes sense for a phase 3 of the pilot, and we presented the blocky load concept, some of the features of the framework. We see a lot of benefits in the sense that it's fairly limited in terms of system changes. This participation model is, for all intents and purposes, enabled today. It's an aggregated NCLR concept. We went over the kind of framework at a high level and some of the proposed telemetry validation. It does seem responsive to some of the points in Commissioner Glotfelte's memo. One of the things that we did note is that, technically speaking, I think it was for 2 in the commissioner's memo, this ability to choose a VPP provider independent of one's retail electric provider would be enabled under the NCLR concept today. So we did kind of note that. But other than that, I think where we are at this point is we're in a position where we could start making, in fact, we have started making some draft red lines to the governing document, but we did want to make sure that, I guess, a couple of things, if there are any questions, and if task force feels that this is the direction to go, and then we can start making those changes and bring in those concepts in the governing document for this task force to review.
Christina, go ahead.
Thanks for this. I have a question about how you're viewing these potential changes in connection with ERCOT's larger work on how to incentivize greater residential participation in DR. So, like, at least for the residential customers, when you're looking at their aggregations, blockiness does definitely help. And then when you think about batteries, they're almost, in a sense, enabling them to engage in like passive DR. So do you view those two things as connected? Kind of the residential DR product work y'all are doing and this work in the pilot, or are these separate for residential?
So I don't think we would see anything here that would not prevent residential aggregation. So maybe that's not a full answer to the question. I'm not sure which initiative was being referenced there. Maybe if you can provide some more clarity on that. But certainly this, to the extent this would enable other resource types that maybe aren't just an aggregation of batteries, we would see a lot of benefit in that. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I think we've kind of used ADER as a giant bucket for a lot of things, right? And so we've got lots of different distribution level resources that can export that are kind of being grouped into this ADER pilot. And we have heard through various channels that ERCOT is working on potential products to incentivize increased residential demand response. And so we were thinking that, at least on the residential level, batteries that may participate in the pilot, a better fit for them may be some of those residential DR and things that you're thinking about, like in another context that, you would enable DR to bid into the ancillary service market and different products. And to the extent a customer has a battery, it enables them to also provide DR because the battery can help power the home. So I don't know if that sheds more light on it or less, but I was just trying to see how y'all are thinking about whether these things are connected or not.
Yeah, I would say that to the extent that there are other discussions that are ongoing, I would see this as maybe separate from any of those discussions. I think we do have residential participants in the pilot now, but to the extent that this enables different types of aggregations, certainly there would be a benefit to that. But I see Mark's hand up, so maybe he has more to add. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is, and Ryan, I think you pretty much hit on it. They're really, this is just really a separate opportunity that we're looking at for residential aggregations of residential premises to participate. I wouldn't say they're aligned necessarily with other opportunities that we're also looking at internally. Okay.
Thank you.
Manny, go ahead.
Hey, Mark, Ryan, appreciate the fact the blocky loads are a good first step. From a second step perspective, are you all thinking about kind of protocol? I can't remember the name of the protocol, but it's the requirement where a load resource is an ALR. The QSC must represent the LSC serving the load all the sites within the ALR. Are you all looking at as well, kind of to potentially revise that?
Not currently. We are not looking at lifting that for the controllable load piece at this point. I won't say that it's off the table. I'm just trying to say it's not something we were looking at doing currently for the current CLR piece. But obviously the way that section of the protocol is written, it only applies if you are having a bid to buy, which if you're a blocky load participating as an NCLR, you won't have a bid to buy in. And that's why we're saying then that wouldn't apply in this other model that the blocky load model that we're considering.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
Chip?
Hey, yeah, thanks. Quick question. So under this proposal, would the LSC and QSC be allowed to be separate entities if you are not participating as a NCLR? In other words, if you're a CLR, would you still be allowed to have a different LSC and QSC?
No, if you're participating under the current model, which is the ALR model, then the QSC representing the ADER or ALR must be the same QSC that represents the LSC. That's what we're saying would remain in effect for the ALR model. But not the blocky load model.
So I guess my question then, is this NCLR model really designed to support additional participation via a new model, or is it really designed to address this issue in the commissioner's memo? Are you trying to do, I understand you're trying to do both, but is it possible that these things could be separated?
So I guess the way I would answer that is that we're not proposing a change with respect to the issue around LSEs and QSEs and retail electric providers. What we're saying is that under the NCLR model today, that separation is possible. So we're kind of just identifying that rather than that's not a policy change, but it's something that we wanted to draw the task force's attention to, that insofar as we enable this, the purpose, I would say, the objective is really to enable the resources that may have difficulty following 5-minute dispatch instructions and may not be terribly interested in submitting bids to buy every 5 minutes, but would be enabled to provide ancillary services. And this is a framework that could enable that. But incidentally, there is also this opportunity, or maybe opportunity is not the right word, but that kind of requirement that everyone has to be your rep, you have to participate with your rep and same QSC. All of those are CLR or ALR only. They're not NCLR.
Okay, yeah, understood. Thank you.
Resmi, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for working on this and offering to update the requirements or uh, the binding document for this. We really support that and support making those updates. The one thing I wanted to clarify is during our last discussion, we did talk about maybe the need to continue to have even this blocky loads be a net injection. And if my understanding is correct, the net injection was put in place for the first ADER because we wanted aggregated load resources which are controllable to be registered as ALRs. And there was no discussion about non-controllable, as there is no aggregate non-controllable policy. So since this is a non-controllable load and there is no aggregate non-controllable participation model, I am my understanding is that there is no need for this this model of the ADER to be net injection. Is that correct, or is, can we have a little bit clarity on that one?
Well, yeah, Ryan, you may take that. So
Go ahead, Mark.
yeah, Resmi, you're right. We were, because of the phase 1 and phase 2 was modeled after the ALR, it required that participation model required this to be a net injection. I mean, a net consumption load. So that's why we were using the offset and everything. But I feel that once we implement a blocky load model, that you wouldn't have to have, since we don't have that concept, that model for an aggregation of sites to participate as an NCLR, then we are kind of free to rewrite the rules around what this blocky aggregated NCLR, what the rules would be, and therefore you wouldn't have the requirement that you have to have a device in there that could inject. That was a long way of hopefully saying what you were after.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thanks for the clarity.
Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I caught that right. So an aggregation of participating RESI devices as an NCLR providing a blocky ancillary service can be a net injector, any individual premise? Like, I would think that the offset would apply if it needed to.
Depends on, and all I'm saying, it depends on exactly how we get down and write the details around the blocky load concept. We're free, I think, to state that it doesn't have to be purely a net consumption value in our system. Well, let me think about that. We're still talking about systems. Well, we still may have to use the offset, but in that case, though, you could participate with all injection devices. Is that your question?
Mark, so if I can real quick, Greg, your answer was, can the devices be injecting? And the answer is absolutely yes. So just like we have that for the existing participation models for ADERs, we do have individual devices that can net inject, and we have the offset to deal with that as we wait for long-term system changes. But for now, we have the offset that allows us to use the existing participation models. The Resmi's question was, could you actually do the opposite? Could you actually have an ADER that's made up entirely of things that are potentially all just changes in consumption, particularly because within the existing protocols, there isn't an aggregate non-controllable load resource. And that was what Mark was really responding to. But absolutely, any ADERs participating in this new participation model could have individual premises, or all the premises could be set up such that they are net injectors, or at least capable of net injecting.
That's helpful, thanks. And it sounds like then the offset would have to carry over to this participation model.
Yes, as of now, the assumption is that the offset would apply.
Okay, thanks very much.
All right, well, thank you, Ryan, Mark, and Dave for going over this new participation model again. I think, Ryan, you may have asked at the beginning about going forth and revising the governing document to reflect this, and I feel like I am getting consensus support for that kind of a markup, but let me ask before we move on to our next topic if there are any violent opposition to that. Rajiv?
No violent opposition from to sort of the concept. I do think, though, the second item in Glotfelty's memo, which would ostensibly be enabled by this under the current rules for NCLR, as I understand it, that is something I think, like, at least we would like to have further discussion on whether we would want to. So it's almost like we're definitely supportive of blocky, but not necessarily on the second piece where enabling blocky might be sort of opening up the participation beyond reps.
Yeah, Rajiv, if I can just respond to that a little bit too, just to go back to what Ryan said. I will say, and this was a question that was asked earlier, our focus really was on thinking about additional megawatts. And not explicitly around this particular item. So that our focus was additional megawatts and thinking blocky load or blocky approach was the way to do that. I think as part of this, we're just simply noting that we could at least re-explore that. And I think Arushi also put it into the chat, sort of some of the reasoning why we were thinking about that differently with this and just how these non-controllable loads participate. But I think part of the question is, do they have to be one and the same? And the answer is yes. So, we could do a blocky approach where we don't change those particular rules. That being said, based on how it works for the non-controllable load resources today, that at least is more open for conversation than it really was as part of the phases 1 and 2. Hopefully that's provides some clarity.
No, that's helpful. Thanks.
All right. Well, with that, Ryan, Mark, and Dave, thank you again. And I think there's an appetite to see the markup of the governing document.
Thanks, Ryan. We'll take that, and I guess as of today, I won't promise a date certain, but as Ryan mentioned, that has been a work in progress. So we'll keep you all up to date as we're getting closer and when we can share something.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. All right. That takes us to our next session on the technical expertise / institutions to talk about the effort to map potential for ADERs. So
I think we're kicking it over to Carmen to lead off that discussion.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Carmen.
Sure. And I encourage my fellow committee members to come on camera too to support in this conversation. I think 20 minutes is probably going to be a little long considering where we're at in the process, but the concept of like how much potential is out there for ADERs was just kind of on my brain in terms of how we were anchoring on this 80 megawatts goal. And was thinking like what existing research is out there to kind of demonstrate that this is either really big, really small, really achievable or not, and how we might get there. And we thought that I thought anyway, that it might be a helpful kind of not litmus test per se, but kind of a way to understand our progress as ADERs are growing, and then potentially prioritization or just understanding how we're doing as different resources come online. One of the reasons it spurred my interest was the recent Texas A&M study that came out on energy efficiency and demand response. It had a pretty big number. I won't quote it because I'll get it wrong, but just having kind of some anchoring numbers there, I think might help us communicate a little bit better around where we're at in progress. So Joel was looking at the notes, presumably, and then sent a message to our working group, and that prompted a little bit of a email exchange wherein we kicked back and forth some different concepts of how we might go about doing that. And again, the why is really about trying to understand what is 80 megawatts a big number, a small number, achievable or whatnot, and then mark it as mark some of the progress that is possibly out there with actual studies or other information that might be out there. So so I kind of kicked that off by saying we could just start kind of a list of historic research that has been done in the state. Maybe there's a lot of potential studies or other papers that were out there. I found one just, you know, about Winter Storm Uri and what demand side resources could have done in that space. We've got the Texas A&M study. Surely there are many more out there as well. And then from there, we got some more hits on like what we could do for primary research potentially if we had the data. But I think we backed off on that pretty quickly given the time and kind of expertise of this group, really looking at more of a secondary research project. Arushi also suggested surveying companies or looking at the comments that have already been submitted, because a lot of those have kind of anchoring numbers around how much potential they could deliver in their resources. And then Michaela also had a call out on some of the modeling tools that might be out there that would help do kind of a primary research analysis. And Tiffany also was pulling in annual reports that we could leverage as well. And that's kind of where we got with some brainstorming, et cetera, and then adding it to the discussion today. So I wanted to give everyone the background on kind of where we're at on just kicking the ball around. First, do a test on, is this seem valuable to the working group? Because we don't want to do it just as a make work project. And then, are there thoughts or feelings about or suggestions about primary versus secondary activities given time and ability to do that? And then finally, if we are agreed on pulling some of these resources together, if folks want to either call out some resources that we should consider and or process by which we want to collate or consolidate those, we are all ears. Anyone from my group want to add in on that ask and or summary?
Excellent job, Carmen.
Great. Well, then maybe we should shift into the discussion part. Or Joel, did you have a question? I see you on camera again.
Oh, yeah. No, I think it sounds like an important effort, maybe important effort for the task force to undertake to, I guess, keep on the commission's radar, you know, what the opportunity is with this program and a future program that hopefully goes beyond 80 megawatts. I think, you know, the task force is definitely made up of a lot of companies that believe there's a lot of room to grow. We don't need to convince ourselves so much as perhaps getting this information out for the commission and ERCOT to see, you know, what value there is to continue working alongside us to get the program in a place where it's a permanent fixture in the market.
Yeah, I think another, to piggyback on that, I think just this last conversation of definitions are going to matter, of what is blocky and how is that defined, because that will affect what potential would fit into this bucket versus other buckets. So I think that's one of the deciding factors around how we would classify different studies that are out there. Are they relevant to the ADER? Are they really capturing potential that's in a different market product or a different market altogether? So anyone out there have thoughts about value add? Does this already exist? ERCOT in particular, be curious to hear what your thoughts are. And Dave, utilities or others, reps, is this useful? Is it not going to be necessarily useful to you? Is it more of a marketing and education tool? Rajiv?
Yeah, I would just say in general, I think it could be tremendously useful for us, both sort of internally and potentially externally from a marketing perspective, et cetera. I think we've been trying to wrap our heads around sort of the size and scope of the opportunity. We have some sort of internal analyses that we've relied on, but anything more to like shed more light on that, I think would be welcome by us.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess the other point to make is obviously the task force is not a marketing entity. It would be for educational purposes to understand how the resources that are coming online or could be coming online scale.
And Carmen, I can chime in as well a little bit. I mean, I just been thinking about it. I see value in it. One of the big questions that we've had for this group is how do we come up with participation models that can bring folks into the overall pilot? And I think it's been hard. I think it's been sort of both groups sort of looking at each other and trying to just trying to make some of those decisions. And is it kind of a if you build it, they will come sort of mode to operate in, or do we end up the other way where we create participation models that no one come to? Of course, we've talked about that as well with honestly, our existing ALR program was obviously something that we put in place because it made sense, but of course we found that for several years we really had this participation model that wasn't useful for folks. So I do think that could be very helpful for us. And maybe the other thing to keep in mind is the question came up during the last part of the discussion around thinking even more broadly around DR type participation and residential participation, maybe in a more general form. That's certainly been something in our minds, not thinking exclusively around the pilot. So, even if there's something that maybe doesn't even fit into the pilot, is there something we can learn to think more broadly around demand response and residential participation that could be helpful?
Yeah, I think those are good. And I think our group doesn't want to boil the ocean. Well, we might want to, but we're trying to keep it within the task force spirit of being time delimited. So another question is like, by when would we want to have something like this ready? And another key question that comes to my mind is also, why is it 80 megawatts right now? And I don't know the answer to that exactly. So any other thoughts from the group that kicked the ball back and forth? Tiffany?
Hello. So I think that, Dave, do we already have a pretty good idea of how many batteries there are under 1 megawatt? Because I know you guys track a lot of the DER stuff. And then I had suggested the utilities have an annual report that they indicate what their DERs are as well. And I think batteries, generally, or I guess it's really the distributed generation. I think the harder question to answer will be like the other load resources, like thermostats, which I guess the A&M report did look at, but one item that might be missing, and I think we have EV group on the line now, is I don't know where you would find out about EVs being able to participate.
Anyone from EV groups want to call that out before I call on the next person? No. Well, that is why we're the research group. So we will research that and see what we can find. And let's see, this, I can't see the name on this.
It's Wayne Calendar, CCS Energy. Yeah, so I guess along what Tiffany was saying as well, I mean, is, you know, because we all have a lot of stuff going on, is there any way to like leverage, you know, things we're already using? And maybe that's what you guys already looked at, which is like the demand response reports, right? The demand response surveys. I mean, to some degree, I know a DER is not an ADR, but or a subset, you know what I mean? But you just asked about thermostats, right? I mean, and so I think that can give you a lot of feedback. And to Tiffany's point, maybe there's some other way of tweaking that survey or something like that a little bit, because it goes out every, you know, as well as she mentioned about the distributed energy resource survey, or, you know, distributed generation survey. You know, is there some way we can tweak the existing stuff that we're already doing? That way we're not really adding any new work, but we're, you know, just adding a couple of questions that might give us a little more insight into this.
Well, and even great points, Wayne. I'm totally with you on the not reinventing the wheel. I hadn't thought of the angle of like adding to those surveys, but I think even at this stage is just what are the key reports that are already being generated that help inform this question? And then I'm thinking of bibliography with maybe megawatt scales on them that could be visible to folks. And then from there, if we all have visibility to that, then we can dive in deeper on which ones are relevant or not, and at least get a thumbnail sketch of what potential is out there, and then maybe missing pieces that could inform a more robust primary research sort of activity if necessary. But I don't think we're not quite qualified at this. I mean, there's others in the group that are qualified to do that, but for the task force in this time frame, I think it's a little too ambitious to take on primary research.
Yeah, I think that demand response survey might give you an idea of, you know, I mean, not necessarily what's out there, but what's actually being utilized, you know. So I think that gives you and then maybe you can draw some inferences from that.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at it too, because if that's what's out there, if we get an inventory of what's out there and the 80 megawatts is supposed to be in addition to, then you're getting to the incrementality, the viability of an incremental amount that's on the scale of 80 megawatts. Okay, good feedback. Dave?
Yeah, I was looking to add, you know, in terms of the DR survey that Wayne was referring to and some of the other reports, you know, maybe as a near term, and again, I apologize too, I missed the last meeting, but, you know, willing to kind of work with you, Carmen, to share what we have, just to make sure we're on the same page of what does exist, and to make sure that, you know, any work you all are doing is filling gaps, not necessarily being duplicative. I know that's the main concern you mentioned. So happy to kind of work with you and share. I guess I think some of what we captured in the DR survey, just as a as a precursor to the discussion, is I'm not sure how much overlap there is in terms of what that does, but regardless, want to make sure you all are aware of kind of reporting that's already going on and what's out there, and to make sure you all aren't looking at doing duplicative work.
Yep. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and on the DG report, I think sometimes it just says other. There's like solar, wind, and then other, and it might be helpful to know what the other is. I know sometimes ERCOT breaks it down in some of the meetings, but I'm not sure if that's part of the regular reporting.
Okay, good to know. On the point of timing, I'm not ready to commit to a timeline here, but just wondering if anyone has suggestions on like maybe the next report or next two reports or Q1, or do folks have a sense of when this would be like really impactful besides yesterday or tomorrow? Give us a little more span.
Hey, Carmen, I guess one thought from my perspective is if we're making recommendations on how we get to 80 megawatts and beyond by the end of the year in response to Commissioner Glotfelty, having some supplemental materials on potential megawatts would be helpful, but that doesn't give us a ton of time. I guess like second best would be a natural reporting point would be alongside our first quarterly report in 2025.
Okay. Which is
Uh,
January?
I
March?
don't know if we have a set date for that. It's been a little fuzzy. We've been flexible in 2024, so I figure there's some flexibility for us in 2025 as well.
Okay. And the Glotfelty memo, remind me the timeline for that.
That
Does it have
was an end of year
end of year?
request. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I will take that back to the group and then we can look at what might be possible even end of year versus the first quarterly. But I'm hearing, generally speaking, useful exercise, don't reinvent the wheel. And secondary does sound like the way to go at this stage. Okay. That's all I have unless my peers want to chime in. All right, thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Carmen. All right. We've got a little bit more time on our meeting here. Wanted to revisit the ongoing inventory of items we have from our last discussion on the roadmap to 80 megawatts. There were a number of items we had mapped as things that we'll need to discuss and work through. And, we'll have at least a November, December meeting to try to address some of these issues. I guess based on discussion today, are there any items we need to add here or amend here in terms of what we're tracking and need to move forward? See, Resmi?
Hey, Joel, the 7th bullet can be removed. That's what we got clarity today. Removing the requirement that ADER being injection megawatt flow. Yeah.
This one. Okay, we have clarity
Yeah.
on this one. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, cool. I'll take that one off for the next meeting. Got Amy?
Yeah, hey Joel, thank you. One of the things that came to mind, Carmen, when you were presenting, and I've been thinking about this in more detail over the last couple of weeks, but it kind of refers to one of the last bullet points on your slide here, Joel, is the potential megawatts available. I think there is really a gap in our potential knowledge or understanding of just how many systems, especially as we look at behind the meter for residential or those small scale systems, like what is actually interconnected and available as we think about what does success look like, right? What are those 80, is the 80 megawatt cap? How do we get there? What's the potential and what are we solving for? I think like trying to figure out how to get better reporting. Maybe it's coordinating on the interconnection reports of what actually is out there and available and where it is located, and being able to better judge then where is our, I'm bad at sports analogies, you guys, but where's the goalpost that we're trying to aim for? Mixing all the sports metaphors for y'all.
How does this work, Amy? I said, answering this question, how many Resi systems are connected today? as a data point to help judge program success and progress.
Yeah, I like that because I think, and ERCOT, you all can weigh in and maybe the TDUs, but like I think there's this gap of, so if systems 1 megawatt below aren't tracked, however, there is a tracking of interconnection of these systems. And so could we combine sort of that reporting into into the ADR task force to really figure out what is the potential we're talking about? So yeah, Joel, I like how you phrased it there.
Okay, cool. Let's see, Tiffany?
Yeah, so another thing, in addition to how many systems are connected today, there's a lot of money coming in through Solar for All and Homes and HERA and all kinds of other federal programs, and TEPRI is involved in developing some of these solar and storage systems and also some demand response systems as well. But a question that I've had, and is kind of close to what we're doing here with ADER, but especially with like telemetry and interoperability, if there are things that we need to be designing into these systems while we're going through the RFP process that people want to bring up, that would be really helpful as well. And then for those who are going to be receiving federal funding, maybe we can add up how many batteries or smart thermostats or whatever are included in those programs.
Okay. So I'll note this, Tiffany, as with respect, as a separate item with respect to federal funding and incentive programs, perhaps a survey of participants on participating or expected megawatts. And then the other point you made was around technical requirement. I guess if I understood your point correctly, you're suggesting that we need to address potential technical requirements that are getting addressed in these RFP processes that would be good to have on our radar for the ADR program as well.
Yeah, like if we can't get IEEE 1547 in the rulemaking, can we get it into the RFPs? You know, so what are some of those like hardware and software requirements that would enable participation in ADER?
Call it aligning technical requirements across ADR and RFPs. Hopefully that captures it all right.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, back to you, Jason.
I actually had a question. And following up on Amy's item 9.1 there. And it may be a question for my fellow TDUs also, Martha and Alex. So Amy, are you thinking that we come back with something, high level, like we have 10,000 residential customers that have a solar installation or something like that? Is that the kind of information that you're looking for on the 9.1?
Yeah, or even more high level, even if we're thinking about like our report back to the commission, is to say, hey, PUCT, there's some information you get on an annual basis, right? Or that you get from TDUs. Can we get that information, or this report would be helpful to judge the success of the program? Unless you all are ready to come with that data. I honestly don't know how frequently you report that or track that to the commission as far as the interconnection of solar only and the interconnection of solar and battery systems. And so I think like, just as we take a step back of like defining what we're trying to solve for, it seems that there's a lack of information of like what is available. And that could be a good source of information of what's available.
Got it. Does anybody with any of the utilities know the answer to do we already report this?
Hey, Jason, it's Martha from Encore. We do file annually with the commission. If there's something more granular that folks are wanting, I'm happy to take that back internally and see if we could, summarize it at a high level somehow, but also open any other thoughts that Alex or others may have as well.
No, that sounds good. Just evaluating the report first, I think would be a good start. Yeah, and we have more detail to help this particular task.
Is that filed in a particular project? I know, incredibly specific question, but I'm just trying to think how best people can get their arms around or hands on it.
These were filed in March of 2024, most recently in 56002.
Okay. Thank you, Martha.
Great, great. I guess we tried our best to map out discussion items to fill 2 hours, but didn't want to try to pack in too much and overrun our time. So I guess as we look to our next meeting, and I'll turn this back to you, Jason, on our last slide. It comes action items and stuff, but I guess my thought is, we're tracking these issues. We can plan to try to knock them out in subsequent meetings. We touched on a couple issues today, but there's a lot still to be discussed. So I guess we'll have to figure out how to do that by end of year effectively.
Yeah, so appreciate everybody's time going through the items today. We are going to have a November workshop. You all should have a doodle poll in your email if you're on the task force to start figuring out what day to get back together. We've got 2 items on Commissioner Glotfelty's memo that we haven't had an initial discussion on yet. And so we'll make sure that we have some time set aside for items 2 and 4. Had a little bit of discussion on 2 today. And so we'll likely be reaching out to folks to present on those topics. And then we do need to start developing consensus on these items. So ticking through each of the items and the issues inventory that was on the prior slide will be important. It's kind of my intention that we try to drive to consensus recommendations in response to the 4 questions in the commissioner's memo by end of year, if possible. It may be that we need to bite off pieces of it, in which case we can respond back to some, but not all of it, and say that we're still working on some of it. But I would like to get consensus around some or all of the questions by end of year, so we can show that progress while ERCOT works on the revision to the governing document. So that's kind of, in my mind, the how I'd like to proceed. Any concerns with that approach? It's probably going to mean that we meet more than just once in December in order to make sure that we tick through all of these issues. But we'll try to make sure we accommodate as many people's schedules as possible in order to make that happen. All right. Well, with that, unless there's something else for the good of the cause, we'll start to bring this meeting to a close, give you back a little bit of time from what we had on the calendar. But let me pause to see if there's any final questions, comments, or concerns from anyone. All right. Well, thanks again to everybody that presented, and Ryan, Mark, and Dave from ERCOT, and everybody else for joining today. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will post the slides in the project along with a link to the recording of this session. And then keep an eye out for the next meeting that we'll have sometime in the first half of November before the holidays. And then, like I said, we will tackle the last two topics in the memo and then start working hard on consensus recommendations. So thanks to all of you for joining and for the work that you'll do between now and the next time we get together. Bye.
Thank you.